My name is Seung-Wook, a member of SSK research team. So I am pleased to introduce Professor Paul Zarembka today. And let me introduce briefly about Professor Paul. And he just published his new book, maybe the topic for today, Key Elements of Social Theory Revolutionized by Marx, published by Brill this year. And he is currently a professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Buffalo, USA. And he published numerous books since 1970s, and including The Hidden History of 9/11 and today's new book. And he also continues his long-term union activism on his campus. And he has been the serious editor for research in political economy since 1977. So welcome, Professor Paul Zarembka. And so first we have 40 minutes presentation and then start our free discussion. And so welcome every participant to write down your questions or comments in chat window. So just after the presentation, we'll have about 30 minutes discussion session. So please start your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to make this presentation, which will be a portion of my book, and by no means all of it, but it does capture one of the important elements of my book. And it follows Michael's talk last week in a good way, because he was focusing on the early parts of Capital, and as you'll see, I'm focusing on the later parts of Capital, so it fits in quite well. I do want to acknowledge the fact that I just read in the New York Times that Marshall Salins, the great anthropologist, just died at age 90. Okay, can you screen share me, or do I screen share myself? I can't remember how to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, I will do that.
Yeah, please.
Let me know when I'm screen shared.
Can you see?
Yes, I can see. But I'm gonna, yeah, fine. But I'm gonna. Well, wait a minute. You're. Is that? I guess that's the same. I don't know. I will be. Let me just move the page one and see if. Did the page move? The page did move, right? No, I'm asking you if the page moved.
Yes.
In other words, am I in control of the page movement, or do you have to do it? That's what I want to know.
I will do that. I can control the page move.
Yeah, but if I have screen share, then maybe it would. I don't know if it works. Okay.
You can share screen share.
Yeah. Please do it by Professor Paul. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll be. Better, I think it'll be easier.
Yeah.
So where are we at? Do we have a screen share now or not?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, let me make some remarks as we set that up. Screen share. To set up the screen share. I want to make a sort of a basic observation about everything I'm going to say today. Not everything, sorry, a lot of what I'm going to say today. And that is a lot of the things we will be talking about today would not have been available without the mega edition of Capital. It's on the one hand, great that we now have the mega edition. On the other hand, we got it very, very late compared to Marx. Okay, so, and one of the things that I am doing in my book is describing the fact that Marx had various editions of Capital, and Michael is correct that the last one that we officially have is the French edition. Michael is also correct that the French translation of the German had some deficiencies that Marx couldn't really fully address, but particularly the early portions of the French edition, not so much the last. That would be part 7 and 8. Okay, because he did that much later. Now I'll be getting to that. Okay, now, so Marx wrote edited the French edition, and also prepared for an American edition, and had his own notes, had his instructions for what he wanted his third edition to look like. Now, unlike Michael, I think we should really obtain a third German edition as Marx wanted his third German edition, not how Engels published it. It's not a big deal. In fact, I basically provide it in my book, and I will be going through that today. But Engels edited, Engels made mistakes. Engels' mistakes had to be intentional, as I will show. So do we have screen share yet?
Yeah, you can share it.
Okay, do you see it now?
We
Or
can,
do I have to set?
yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, we're good now, right?
Yeah. It's
Yes.
okay.
Okay. Now I want to make I have a comment on the screen right now, and that is Engels wrote in 1891. In other words, that's it's 8 years after Marx's death and about 4 years before his own death, that Marx completed his work in the end of the 1850s. It's a remarkable comment. I mean, I'm making a negative comment about it. For Engels to say that, because I mean, actually he edited volumes 2 and 3 as if they were very important, and yet they were not written until the early 1860s. And this is not even apart from the issue of what the French edition or even the second German edition was compared to the first German edition. So what I'm going to be basically doing today is saying that we do not really have Marx's final edition, but we can get Marx's final edition. And I myself in my book call that the 1882 edition, because Marx really didn't do anything in 1883 because he died in March. So what I'm basically saying is we have an 1882 edition that Marx wanted, and this is important. It's the German edition. I'm not talking about today about translation issues. I'm talking about what the German edition should have looked like compared to what Engels provided us over the years. Now, let me go to the next screen. So I look at what Marx wanted for his third. So I'm always talking about Marx's third edition compared to Engels's third edition. Okay, it's not the same thing. Marx's third edition, as he wanted it for the first 6 parts of Capital, Volume 1, is quite acceptable. I mean, there's a few things, but Marx did not make many changes from the second German edition for what he wanted the third German edition to look like. There's only, so, and furthermore, Engels almost always complied with everything through part 6 of the second German edition, with only 2 exceptions that, at least that I think are important. One is that in the French edition, Marx deleted all references to subsumption of labor or subjection of labor, depending on what English word you use. He had deleted all of it. And that's what he wanted for his third edition. That's a substantive problem, because in the English edition, we have that whole results part added to the Penguin edition as if that belonged there. But I don't think it belonged there. Marx didn't have it there. And furthermore, some of the things that are in there, like subjunction, were left out of the earlier parts of Marx's third edition. Engels did not comply with that. Okay, he left it in. The second thing is, and this seems to be kind of unimportant, Marx, but it is not so unimportant. Marx wanted part 2 to be divided into 3 chapters, but Engels did not comply. He kept it in as 1 chapter. However, now this is kind of interesting. In part 3, there was one place where Marx wanted for his third edition a section divided up into subsections, and Engels did comply with this one. Now, why do I make a big deal about it? Such a minor thing. I make a big deal out of it because that tells you that that Engels was reading the instructions of Marx and making his own decisions of whether to comply or not. So we know he knew what Marx wanted for the divisions of capital. Now, I first of all say that through part 6, Engels's third and fourth editions can be accepted with a couple of exceptions I've just talked about. I prefer that the buying and selling of labor power should appear as a distinct chapter in the German. It doesn't, but okay. I mean, the substance is not different. But I think this is an important point, and that is, if you're reading the German edition through the first 6 parts, that's it's except for a couple of exceptions. I mean, everything, it's okay. It's fine. It's fine. It's Marx's desires for the third German edition in Engels's third and fourth editions. So if you want to say what's Zarembka talking about, I mean, actually, I'm talking more about what comes after that, which I personally consider important. So if you're actually focusing on part 7 and part 8 of Marx's volume 1, then of course these things that I'm talking about become important. But if you're not interested in those last parts, not interested in primitive accumulation, for example, then it doesn't have great consequences. Now I'm going to go through. So now what I'm talking only about what Marx wanted. I'm not talking about what Engels did, because that's what I'm trying to say, that we have a final edition of Marx. In the third edition, Marx wanted the introduction to use the French edition. So that means the whole thing. okay, but it's short. This is his instructions after the French edition. This is up to 1882. On the other hand, he had a few changes in the chapter on simple reproduction compared to the second German. So now I'm just laying out what Marx wanted. Okay, so the next chapter, conversion of surplus value into capital in the third German edition. Marx again wanted some changes from the second German, using the text of the French, using the text of the French edition. However, most significantly is he had, for the general law of capital accumulation, there was huge pages that he instructed to be taken out of the French edition, translated into German, and put into his third German edition. By my count, it's something like 19 was full use from the French into his German, Marx's third German edition. And the next point I'm going to make is rather well known, and that is the single chapter on primitive accumulation was in the second German edition. That was to be broken into 7 chapters, as in the French. And then you have the last chapter on colonialism, which I'm really be addressing very much today. The introduction to part 7 in English edition is mostly, I'm getting it, okay, is mostly, he mostly complied with it. I mean, there's a couple of sentences here, I don't really, I mean, I went through every single sentence, okay. In the first chapter of part 7 on simple reproduction, they were some suggested changes by Marx, and they were incorporated by Engels. The next chapter is going to be the general law of capitalist accumulation, which I will be dealing with in a second. But before I do that, I want to talk about this, what I consider to be the simplest error of Engels. And I'm emphasizing this because it has nothing to do with any work that Engels would have had to do. This is a conscious decision of Engels. Marx clearly instructed the structure of the third German edition to have 8 parts and 33 chapters, partly due to the breaking up of part 2, but mostly the breaking up of primitive accumulation into a separate part, 8, as it was in the French edition, and dividing the parts of the primitive accumulation chapter in the French, in German, into 7 chapters. Now, I'm saying something. I've had this dialogue before with people. I have a feeling that it makes kind of a difference when you grew up the first time you were reading Marx, whether you were looking at him in the English edition or in the German edition. Because when you're looking at the German edition, you're looking at 7 parts. When you're looking at the English edition, you're looking at 8 parts. Now I have to get to the issue about why the English edition is in 8 parts, okay? By the way, I prefer the more Aveling edition because that was done by people who knew Marx closely. And so, but that's another story. Now, what's kind of interesting is that the modern French edition actually restores the third German edition of Engels rather than what Marx himself wanted for his third edition. And it's not even explained. They just do it, okay? As if what Engels did for the third German edition is correct, and it's not correct. As simple as that. Everything I'm talking about today, I'll repeat again, has nothing to do with translation issues. It has to do with substantive matters. So I'm trying to focus on getting a correct German edition of Capital, and then we can worry about translations into Spanish or whatever, Persian or whatever. Okay, so now I have on the screen the structural division of the first German edition, which had, it was called chapters, and it had 6 chapters. I don't really want to focus on it. The second German edition, which was published in 1873, but available in 1870, I mean, ready in 1872, had 7 parts. And now pay attention, the French parts 1 to 6 were sort of being prepared simultaneously with the German second. And actually some of the French was published before the second German. So the first parts, 72, 73, there's an interface with the second German and the French, but for parts 7 and 8, and I have this in italics, Marx did not prepare it until 2.5 years later in 1875. And that's that I think reflects the fact that Marx's ideas were changing. And that's why he puts in primitive accumulation to a separate part. Okay. So important is that Marx intended his third edition to have 8 parts in German, but he died in March of 1883. Engels, however, used only 7 parts, and basically violating the instructions that he had. What's a topic I'm not sure I can talk too much about today, depending on how the time moves, and that is Engels was the editor of the 1887 edition in English, and it has 8 parts. It follows the instructions. I'm not sure why, but I have some ideas. Anyway, coming back, Engels makes some improvements to his third German edition in his fourth German edition, but basically does keep the structure the same. And there's not that much changes between the third and the fourth German edition. So if you want to understand what Engels was doing, you have to look at the third German edition, because the fourth German edition was just tightening up some things that had been left out. Okay, now, in the French edition, as I said before, Marx has a new part 8 titled Primitive Accumulation. And he has the first chapter. This is in the French, Secret of Primitive Accumulation. And then he has it divided up into 7 chapters. Marx instructed whoever that his third edition would follow the French. You can see that documented in the mega volume, which I cite here. The next chapter in the German edition has, in fact, 7 parts. In the French, they had 8. Excuse me, had 7, but as chapters, not as sections. Engels left all those as 1 chapter. The result is you see 33 chapters. You see 33 chapters in the French. If you look at the English, either the Penguin edition or the International Publishers edition, you see 33 chapters. Now, whether it has 33 chapters or 25 chapters would not be important if there weren't substantive changes. and there are a lot of substantive changes in the latter parts of part 7 and 8. I make a remark here just about the what's going on between Marx and the Russians. Danielson prepares a translation of Marx based upon the first German edition, which was published before the second German edition. In fact, there's even correspondence between Marx and Danielson that it's a pity, Marx is writing to him, it's a pity that I don't have the second edition ready for you as you translate it for the Russian. So if you're Russian and you don't read German, you're reading from 1871, the translation, the Russian translation, you're reading from the translation of the first German edition, not the second. And that takes us all the way up to the end of the century. And that's important for understanding Russian intellectual history and Marxism. That the people were reading it. Yeah, it's even kind of strange that even Lenin didn't point out what edition the changes in the edition, and that the Russian edition was only based upon the first edition. He wasn't conscious of that, of the importance of these changes, and yet the second edition itself had important changes from the first. Also, I comment that Marx continued to have a lot of interchanges with the Russians, basically through the rest of his life. So let me go to the next screen. One of the things that I found fascinating is that Marx wrote Engels. Marx learned Russian after he published Capital Volume 1 in 1867. He wrote Engels in 1870 that the most important work besides his own was Fedorovsky's Condition of the Working Class or Peasant Class in Russia, which was published in 1869. He says that's the most important work he's read except for Engels's work. Okay, that's a fantastic recommendation. Engels is getting this, okay, in 1870. And frankly, he ignores it. I mean, Engels doesn't understand that Marx is continually working on his theoretical work, and that Russia is a very important background, at least in part, for his changing perceptions, for example, of the issue of primitive accumulation, which I'll be talking more about. I cite at the bottom of the screen, James White has a book called Marx and Russia, The Fate of a Doctrine, which, I mean, really lays out a lot of the importance for Marx of a study of Russian. By the way, as an aside here, when Marx died, there was about 100 or so books about Russia that Marx had, and Engels donated all of them to, I think, Leverov. Not sure right now, but he donated all of them to a Russian, which is okay. I mean, I can understand that Engels himself didn't, I mean, you know, had other things to do than to start a new topic in his life, but he didn't appreciate why it was important for Marx. That's kind of my problem, is his lack of appreciation, lack of trying to even understand why this might be important. Okay, so now we come to the issue of the secret of primitive accumulation. This is the first chapter of the part on primitive accumulation in the English, or the chapter of the long chapter. It's a section of the long chapter in the German. And now I get to where I really fault Engels. I can't say it any other way, okay? If you look at the at the beginning of that chapter on the secret of primitive accumulation, or primitive accumulation, the part depends on whether you're looking at the French or the English. There's a 3-page introduction. Engels, so Marx says, take the whole thing from the French and move it into the German. That was his intentions. He didn't do it. He didn't accomplish it. He wanted to take his own French version and write it back into German for his Marxist 3rd edition. What does Engels do? He takes everything except the last paragraph. How? I mean, you can't justify going through everything and then deciding in the very last paragraph not to make the change. And what's the change that Marx wants for his introduction to primitive accumulation? And that is to narrow the focus, not to a general theory, but to a theory focused on, primitive accumulation focused on Western Europe. So Marx is saying, he's basically saying, I don't know about Russia, I don't know about India, I don't know about China enough to incorporate primitive accumulation into those societies. And that's coming out of a couple things, and that's coming out of Marx is doing some additional work on early German history and doing this work I've already mentioned in Russian history and other aspects. So Marx is holding back and not making his theory so all-encompassing as he had in the 2nd German edition, because he had done this work in 1871 to 1875, which is reflected in the French edition. And then he does further work and reinforces for him the idea that he wants the French edition to be the basis of his 3rd German edition. And basically, Engels is saying, no, I'm not going to let you go there. I'm not going to let you put that last paragraph in there. In the very next chapter, which will be a German section on expropriation, Engels fails to change an instruction from Europe to Western Europe. That's what another change that Marx wanted for his 3rd edition. Again, delimiting things down, taking Russia out of the equation. Okay, let me move on here. I'll kind of skip this. I'm providing here the German and the French. Basically, the point is that expropriation is Marx is less and less convinced that expropriation is being completed, that it's a process. And the words he used reflect a slowing of the process, a more hesitancy about the process than he had before. Now, I said before that the general law of capitalist accumulation had lots of changes. Perhaps I won't spend too much time on these, although I do. My book, okay, which is here, okay, it provides actually into English, provides the translation from the French into English of what, into English now, of what Marx had intended for the general law of capitalist accumulation. So if you're reading English and you look in my book, you can find out what the general law of capitalist accumulation would read if it had followed Marx's instructions for his third edition. And I note here, for example, in section 2, that Marx had whole passages that he wanted from the French to go into the third German that Engels did not do. Also, look at the change in the title. Note, I mean, it's a long title, so I can't expect you to sort of grasp it too much, but just look at the word here, concentration. Concentration is no longer in the title of the French edition and what Marx wanted for his third edition. It now focuses more on employment, basically. I just made a mistake. Okay. I also provide here the third section. Again, whole passages in the French are marked by Marx for substitution and elaboration in the third German, and again are left out by Engels. I think part of it might have to do with the fact that you had economic crisis in the early 1870s, and these early crises, the early 1870s crisis, which led to massive unemployment in some countries. Okay, perhaps led Marx to be more interested in the employment issue and the buying and selling of labor power than he had been. Or put it another way, concentration or centralization of capital becomes less important than employment. Just a second, did I leave out something here? No, that's it. Okay. So I won't elaborate these changes here, because I mean there's actually a lot of changes, but it has to do with basically Marx's perception of how the economy operates and how he's describing it. You come now to Engels in 1890. I'm being critical of Engels. I'm sorry, but you come to 1890 and Engels is still sitting there. I mean, with the book, and he could have said, "Oh, I made a mistake. There was 19 pages that from the French into the German that I forgot to change, and I'm sorry. I'm going to make those changes now." We didn't do it. I don't get it. I kind of get it, but I don't 100% get it. Anyway, now the next problem is the English edition. Now this is important. Engels follows Marx's instructions for the structure. I mean, completely in the English edition. Why? I don't know. I really don't know. Okay. This also comes to the issue about the fourth German edition. If he, in 1887, in the English edition says, "Hey, I made a mistake about the structure," he could have said, "Okay, now when I get to the fourth German edition, I'll change the structure to what Marx wanted." But he didn't. I don't get it. Okay, because it's not work. Okay. I don't know why Engels was the editor. I mean, Engels didn't translate the English edition. Moore and Aveling did. They may have picked up Marx's instructions. Another possibility is Eleanor Marx was absolutely fluent in French, German, and English, where she was born and raised. She may have realized that Marx really wanted the French edition structure and told Moore and Aveling that. And Engels maybe didn't want to contravene what they decided. I don't know. That's speculation. Now, kind of an interesting thing is that the Penguin edition follows the German edition. And that's kind of strange. I mean, if you're now providing, if you're basing the Penguin edition on the third German text, why don't you follow the structure of Engels's third German text? I mean, I don't quite get that either. Just because Engels happened to allow the structure of the English edition to be 33 chapters, is that a good enough reason to sustain? If you really believe that the French Engels's third German text is the appropriate text. But anyway, I can pass on that. Now, I want to conclude here with a few things here about the Capital Volume 3, and it'll just take me about 5 more minutes. If you look in the actual manuscripts of Marx's Volume 3, they were written in 1863, and Marx never really re-examined his Volume 3 work. I mean, you have to, I mean, we need to recognize that. Particularly, if you look at Marx's use of the word organic composition of capital, technical composition, value composition, whatever it could, those three concepts are ambiguous in earlier portions of Marx's work. It's only in the French edition that Marx finally delimits the technical composition different from the value composition, and that distinct from the organic composition, which is only the value composition insofar as it is determined by the technical composition. The organic composition and the value composition are not the same thing any longer when you get to the French edition. While before, Marx had been kind of confused about that. And if you look at the ratio C over V, which is very often used as the value composition, very often people will say that's the organic composition. That's not the organic composition, that's the value composition. I will say point blank today, I think we should drop out the word organic composition, and I'm gonna propose a substitution here, okay? Now, the problem I want to mention about Engels is that Engels at a certain point takes the definition of the organic composition that's in the French edition and himself, not Marx, puts it in his edition of the Volume 3, as if Marx was clear in 1883 about the difference between the organic composition and the value composition, which is not the case. Now, what I want to propose is, this is the concluding part. I want to just take me a couple more minutes here. So I'm going to propose that the organic composition could be labeled C over B plus S. However, things are too confused now, so I will use what Elmore Shakes' word for that and call that the materialized composition of capital. And that does reflect, I think, technology more than C over V does, because C over B plus S refers to the total length of the working day, not the paid portion of the working day. If S over V changes, then C over V changes, but C over V plus S does not change. So I think one of the basic points I'm making about Marx is moving throughout his life. He's deepening his theory. This is one place where I think he could have gone a step further, but he didn't. He could have recognized C over B plus S as an accurate description of what he called the organic composition of capital. And I just point out that Rosa Luxemburg did figure it out on her own. I mean, I mean, I have it right there on the screen. She explicitly stated that that C over B plus S is the appropriate conception. And nobody paid, I mean, nobody paid attention to that for so many years. And then you get to the 1960s, and we start to get some people paying attention to that. And Anwar Sheikh labeled it, it was not new, he just had a word for it, materialized composition of capital. And I think that's as good as any. I also want to point out here that Engels did a lot of discussion, and this, I compliment Engels here. I mean, he added his own chapter to volume 3, which explained cotton spinning, and you can calculate this C over V plus S from Engels's work for cotton spinning around the 1870s. And the materialized composition of capital it's not a time trend, it's just a word, it's just a fixed point in time. It's 1.77. I did some of my own work in the United States, and basically I more or less come to it being near 2.0. Of course, that's, anybody can talk about whether those numbers are accurate or not. The final thing I have on the screen here, and then I'm finished, is how you can address, if you're interested in the rate of profit, you can use it with C over V plus S. The advantage of it is that the technical issue is separated out from the rate of surplus value issue. And that's part of the basic message that I've been trying to say throughout this talk, is that Marx is evolving, and we have to be evolving beyond Marx. And this is an example of where I think we ought to be evolving. I would make one other comment before I quit here. And that is, when Marx is first discussing his organic composition of capital in 1883, he's not talking about time trend. He's not talking about the falling or rising rate of profit or anything like that. He's going across industries, and therefore he's not concerned with changes in the rate of surplus value across, and he's taking that is given and then looking at changes in technology. It's only when he then moves to the rate of tendency, the rate of profit, does he build on what he had been talking about. Okay, that's all I've got.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a very interesting presentation. So there are lots of things to be discussed together. So if any questions from those participants, feel free to write your questions in chatting room, or please raise your hand or turn on your microphone and give your questions to Paul. And any questions? No? So yeah, very long question from Seung-Jin. Yeah, Paul, thank you very much for great talk. Your comparison of Marx's original instructions for the revision of Das Kapital for Engels for the German third edition, based on the French edition with the actually published German editions by Engels, is really judicious. You are finding that Engels did not faithfully follow Marx's instructions, especially part 7 on capital accumulation, is quite novel and convincing. Your painstaking work is a great contribution to the development of Marxian economics. I wish your findings be reflected in the future editions of Das Kapital, including the Korean editions. Yeah, and then have 3 questions for you. First, you argued that Engels' non-compliance of Marx's instructions for revision of Das Kapital, especially regarding part 7 on so-called primitive accumulation of capital, was intentional. Could you be more specific of the intentional? Do you mean that Engels was Eurocentrist? This is the first question. And second, Do you think that Marx became suspicious of his law of TRPF due to the increasing OCC, i.e. C over V, which he had originally formulated in Grundrisse and Capital, Volume 3, when he implicitly introduced the concept of materialized composition of capital in the Frenchization of Das Kapital, Volume 1? Or do you agree with Michael Heinrich against Andrew Kleeman or Michael Roberts, etc., in the recent debates on Marx's law of TRPF? Yeah, that's his question.
Let me go with the first one first, obviously. The issue about the intentions of Engels. I mean, you're asking me to explain the intentions. What I don't have a full answer to that. It's kind of part of my own question. What I meant by saying intentional is that it's quite obvious that he knew what he was doing. Why he did what he did is, let's put an outstanding question that I can't fully resolve. But whatever the reason is, I think it really had really serious consequences for Marxism for the next 100 years or whatever. I mean, there's this whole discussion about the letter that Marx drafted 3 different times to Boris Suzlich about what Marx was intending to say. That's part of the whole picture here. There's issues of the connection between Engels. Actually, let me say it more. There's a division between the line of Marxism that went from Marx to Danielson, distinct from the line of Marxism that went from Marx to Engels to Lenin. I think there's a different path that they followed. Rosa Luxemburg is pretty much in that, even though she's not really conscious of it, she's more or less in that Danielson path. And that's the path, frankly, I'm in. Okay. I'm in the path of Marx, Danielson, Luxemburg. Could you repeat the second question? So yeah, you could say that Engels is Eurocentric, and maybe that's the answer. You know, I mean, maybe Marx just has a broader vision of the world and is more skeptical about his own, you know, that his theory is so broad than Engels. And even if you're giving, so even if you say that that's correct, it still doesn't absolve Engels from not following what I mean, you're a translator. I mean, why can't you translate what the instructions say? That doesn't absolve him. He can have his own opinion. You can, but follow what Marx wanted you to do. I don't get it 100%. I don't get it 100%. They were obviously close friends. I don't get it. Can you repeat the second question?
Is about your idea of organic composition of capital and its relationship with the theory of TRPF.
With which theory?
Yeah, tendential fall of
the tendency to fall rate. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't get it. I think that's an empirical question. I think that we should separate out the technical issue by using C over B plus S from the rate of surplus value issue, separate question. And if there is a movement in the rate of profit, try and figure out which it's doing, which factor is more important. I'm just telling you what I kind of suspect empirically is that C over B plus S is not changing all that much. So the rate of profit really is depending upon, the actual numbers. The actual rate of profit is more depending upon the rate of surplus value, but also the difference between productive and unproductive labor, which I haven't talked about at all today. So the rate of profit on productive labor could be rising, and yet the proportion of the economy which is in the productive sector falling, and therefore the overall rate of profit for the whole economy could be falling even as the rate of profit in the productive sector is rising because of the rising rate of surplus value. It's a complicated discussion. Is that good enough, Seung-Jin?
Yeah, and also he has his third question, and the last part was erased. So please, Seung-Jin, say about the full sentence. I can't read the final part. So.
Yes, Professor Zarembka, thank you very much for your kind answers to my questions. Yes, my third question is, I would like to know your thoughts about the misuse or privilegization of the concept of centralization in the second and third international Marxist theorization of monopoly capitalism, which, for example, I think the concept of centralization, that concept Marx first introduced in the French edition of Das Kapital. As we know, Marx did not introduce the concept of centralization in the first and second German edition of Das Kapital, where he just distinguished two kinds of concentration, that is fragmentation versus attraction of capitals, etc. So, my question is that, you in your presentation, you mentioned that in in French edition, Marx erased the subtitle concentration, and you talked that Marx instead is focused on the employment effect of the capital accumulation. But one of the new things that Marx introduced in the French edition is that he newly introduced the concept of centralization. And I think Engels very faithfully is followed Marx's instructions in that respect and reflected them in the third and fourth German editions. But I think it is very problematic from my from my point of view, as I just mentioned, considering the so-called is a very problematic theory of monopoly capitalism. So my question is, I would like to know your thoughts.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for the question. I don't have an answer. I recognize exactly what you said. I saw it myself, but at the same time, you have to look at the fact that even the word concentration is dropped out of the title of section 2 of General Law of Capitalist Accumulation, and he refocuses on employment. So whatever this thing is about the difference between centralization and concentration, whatever the importance of that is, it's in the context, I feel, in the context of the unemployment crises that were occurring in the early 1870s. But I don't have any insight into how we should work with that. I'm waiting to hear what you have to say about that one. Okay.
Okay,
아,
thank you.
그러니까.
Yeah, and the next question is from Mihail Heinrich. He has a remark about the changes done by Engels. So please turn on your microphone and give your comments.
Yeah, thank you. I have two remarks. The one remark is about Engels and the changes which Paul described very carefully. Paul, you said several times you don't have an idea why Engels did this, followed Marx's instruction in one point, didn't follow in another point. As far as I can overlook these changes, I cannot recognize any theoretical pattern that Engels had some theoretical ideas and therefore he followed certain instructions and didn't follow others. I would be very interested if anybody could say there is a kind of theoretical pattern. I cannot see one. And insofar, my idea, my suspicion is that Engels did several mistakes. He wanted to publish the third edition of Capital very quickly after Marx's death. He was also occupied with a lot of other duties. And so a number of mistakes happen. I don't think they follow from Eurocentrism or other things. It were just mistakes. There were also mistakes, for example, when he included parts from the French edition, he had to translate in German. And in this translation, at least in one point, he did a considerable translation error, what then also was translated in English. So there were not only errors in the structure, there were also basic some translation errors. All this, I would say, was just the result of that Engels was overburdened with duties. He also was not the youngest when he did this. And later, when he published the fourth edition, he was in the middle of preparing volume 3, what was very exhaustive for him. And so preparing the fourth edition of volume 1, he didn't open the whole work again. He didn't check what he did in the past. He just added some more changes, but it was not a systematic evaluation of what he did before. And insofar, I think what would be necessary is an edition of Capital, which has all this in mind, which, not to repeat the mega edition, where we have 6 volumes for volume 1, but to have a critical edition of volume 1, which gives a record about the changes in the French. Is this change in the French translation transferred to the German third or fourth edition, or is it not, and so on. So this was my remark to Engels' changes. Now I want to do a second remark to your last.
Excuse me. Can I answer that first? Because so I just, is that okay?
Yeah.
Did I? Okay.
Okay.
And
Okay.
then we'll come to the second. Okay. There's 2 problems with being so generous about Engels. The first problem that I tried to illustrate was it was so easy for him to use the structure of the French edition in the third German edition as Marx instructed, but he didn't. Why not? It was, that's not work. That's not, that there's something else going on there. Okay. That's why I emphasize it, because it's so simple an error. And the second thing is, how do you explain in the primitive accumulation that one paragraph, which he translates everything, and then Engels doesn't translate the last paragraph? I mean, from the second German, changing it to what Marx wanted in the third German. Why one paragraph? How could Engels stop at the very last paragraph, except that there was something going on? I mean, there's something he wanted to, I think he was arresting, I mean, I'll say it, I don't know any other way. He was arresting Marx's theory as if it were more, we don't put it more dramatic, more encompassing than in fact Marx wanted at that point. That's all I can say to your first point. I understand what you were also saying, you know, but even when you come to the fourth German, why didn't he incorporate the structural changes from the English edition, which he had right in front of him, into the fourth? I mean, okay, that's all I have to say.
Yeah. Okay, I just to add this, that it was just an accident of Engels. I proposed, because I don't see a theoretical pattern that I could say, okay, Engels had this or that idea, and because of this, he did the decision to accept the one change and not the other. I don't see such a theoretical pattern. If anybody could explain this, it would be very interesting to hear this, but until now, I didn't hear. But I wanted to make my second short remark. Your last sentence, Paul, on the slide, it was very important. And I fully agree. You said Marx's thoughts were evolving, and that this is a basic message of your presentation. I fully agree. Marx's thoughts were evolving, but when you take this seriously, then I think we should be a little bit more cautious to talk about a final version of Capital Volume 1. What you said from these instructions, we can see the final version which Engels didn't completely execute. I think there was in the year 1882, there was not a final version. You stress this list of instructions, and this is correct. But there were also the studies of Marx in the 70s. And a number of these studies, I think they aimed also to a change of Volume 1. For example, in the late 70s, Marx studied very extensively the big historical work of Schlosser, one of the leading German historians in this time. And what was he studying? What was he excerpting? It was about late Middle Ages, the way cities were emerging and cities were becoming more important and so on. It was a lot of material which could be included in a new formation of primitive accumulation. Marx also was occupied a lot with natural sciences, with technology in the last in the second half of the 1870s. And insofar, also this gives hints for a further reworking, changing of Volume 1. Insofar, I would conclude the real final shape, the final Volume 1 we don't know. We only can reconstruct some ideas which probably would have influenced, would go inside this volume, but I would be very cautious to speak of a final shape of volume 1.
I 100% respect that perspective. I have no, so maybe I I dramatized it too much, but what I was really trying to say is that Marx had, there is an edition of Marx in 1882 that we should be using. And then we can, I mean, start from that. I mean, perhaps I am less sympathetic. I mean, I'm less interested in your last talk, when you talk about all the different changes, 8 editions. I myself am less interested in that discussion. I would be more interested in saying, okay, this is what Marx had in 1882, and then backtrack to exactly the kinds of topics you're talking about, and then speculate how that might have, how Marx, like you're doing, exactly 100% like you're doing, speculate how Marx was moving forward in his late work as that next, he had to write, he had to publish a 3rd edition because the publisher was saying, I'm running out of copies. The publisher told him that over several years. I mean, it really was, he didn't have the time any longer to not get out a 3rd edition. He died before it happened. If he had survived, for several months, I think we would have had his 1880, I mean, what I call his 1882 edition, would have been his edition, not Engels' edition. And then we could then talk about what, what else he might have done, which would have been, and maybe if he'd lived 5 more years, he would have done some of that, So anyway, I 100% respect what you're saying.
Yeah. Okay. And then a short comments from Jung-Young. It's about the meaning of intention. So he suggests, in that case, sometimes it is better to use purpose rather than intention.
Propose?
Purpose.
Why?
Yeah.
I mean,
Purpose.
Yeah. So it's just a short comment. So I have a question, just about the kind of reverse effect of Engels' edition of volume 2 on the edition of volume 1, because the year 1883, the publication of the 3rd edition is just about the time of his finishing work of the volume 2. So do you have any idea about this kind of reverse impact of Engels' idea of editing volume 2 on the kind of re-edition of volume 1, like volume the edition, 3rd edition or 4th edition, just after his editing of volume 2, because the many manuscripts written by Marx about volume 2 were written between 1870 to 1880. So sometimes I'm curious about this kind of reverse effect.
I suspect that Engels didn't really have that. Marx died, and he wanted, and the editions of Capital were running out. He had to get it, like, he had to get out. He felt he had to get out a 3rd edition, and I don't think, I may be wrong. I don't think there's much interface. When was the 2nd volume 2 was what, 1885? Trying to 1885, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that was the next step after his edition of
Yeah. Okay.
By the way, I mean, Michael, but coming back to your point, I'm sorry to come back to Michael's point. I think you got a very good point there. I have not, and I myself don't have a full explanation, but you have driven me to try and find an explanation about why Engels is doing what I would think more about it. Okay, but sorry, I did I answer the question about volume 2 to volume?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So any other questions from the participants? Yeah, okay. So today we had a very interesting presentation and discussion. So yeah, so our discussion will be going on for further elaboration. So thank you very much, Professor Paul Zarembka. Yeah, and please give your final some remarks for us.
Yeah, I just want to make some remarks.
Yeah.
This I'm gonna. When you introduced me, you said that I wrote a book on September 11th. Okay, you remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Hidden History of 9/11. So I'm gonna jump to the last chapter of my book. I'm just gonna mention. I mean, because this is so out of space for many people's discussion, but I just want to say something. Okay.
Yeah, great.
And that is that Marx was quite aware of conspiracy. I mean, it's absolutely clear to me. I mean, he did. Okay. And there's so many Marxists that somehow don't want to touch September 11th. I mean, I don't understand it. Okay. At least in the United States. So my last chapter isn't so much about September 11th. It's sort of indicating what Marx was saying about, for example, leading up to the American Civil War, and Marx's initial avoiding of what Abraham Lincoln was doing in Congress in 1847 to 49, but then he becomes more aware of what might be going on. But I also go through many other cases. For example, it's well known that the Manchurian incident was a fake incident, a manufacturing incident which led to the Japanese invasion of China. So anyway, there's all kinds of parts of history, the Kennedy assassination, all these things. We as Marxists need to take these issues seriously, insofar as everybody's talking about it against conspiracy theories these days, but conspiracies happen. And the problem is figuring out whether a particular instance is actually I mean, you have to analyze it case by case. It's a big deal. So I just want to make that comment.
Yeah. The title of part 3 of his book is Considering Nationalism and State Machiavellianism. And the final chapter, the title is Marxism, Machiavellianism, and Conspiracy Theory. Thank you very much for your short introduction of your other part of your book. And today, thank you very much for your presentation. And thank you very much for the comments and questions from other participants. So we will meet again this Thursday. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.